Labor lawyers would have a field day with this parable. Fortunately, we're not talking about labor law or union contracts here. This gospel passage reflects the words of today's first reading, when God says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways." The scripture story is about God's extravagant grace and overwhelmingly generous heart. This morning, we will talk about how to seek this abundant grace and how we are called to give and receive it in the ordinary moments of our lives. I think it's important to recognize that God's generous grace is always available to us. So how do we receive this extravagant grace? We need only to open our hearts, accept it, and live according to that grace. In his scripture commentary, author and theologian Bruce Epperly says, "God still bestows grace upon grace. We are always receiving grace in terms of energy, possibility, insight, and intuition. Opening to grace, moment by moment, changes our vision and may eventually change our circumstances." Let's consider some ways this can happen in our daily life. In recent conversations with some of our faith community members, they mentioned to me how much they missed being together in person and how they really needed a hug. And although for the last 6 months, we've given one another extravagant virtual hugs, here in person and on Zoom, it's not quite the same as a warm bear hug. How can we receive the extravagant grace of a hug without actually touching the person we long to hug, whether community member, family, or friends? Maybe it could be through the twinkle in their eye, their warm smile, or their facial expression conveying joy, compassion, or understanding. Maybe their voice and their words embrace us with grace. Earlier this week, Stan and I met a young family on our walking route. Their 3-year-old son, Max, was telling us how his 4-month-old sister, Cabri, always smiles at him. To demonstrate, he got off his small training bicycle and looked into Cabri's eyes as she was lying in the stroller. Right on cue, she broke into a huge smile. This little moment in time flooded us with God's extravagant grace. We laughed and celebrated their connection, along with their mom, who was beaming. She too felt this grace. Max knew instinctively that this exchange between him and his little sister was special. He would not have put the words, God's grace, to it, but that's what it was. A thunderous waterfall overflowing with God's abundant grace. Nature also generously embraces us with God's grace, whether watching fish swim in a pond or turtles sunning themselves, listening to the serenade of cicadas and crickets, or walking a tree-lined street. Recently, we hiked through a meadow at Hildeseed Nature Preserve in Media. 2 months ago, The entire meadow was open, and you could see clear through to the opposite side, 500 yards away. Donning its full end-of-summer wardrobe, the meadow was now filled with tall, 7-foot-high grass. As we walked along the path through this high grass, I opened my heart to the grass's peaceful embrace and received a hug of extravagant grace that grounded me in the midst of many commitments. It's good for us to notice the ordinary moments in people and in nature that grace us with love, that hug us tight, especially during this time of social distancing. It's important to feel that hug long after it's given by pondering it and allowing the embrace to reach into our being. Simple, practical actions also embody God's extravagant love. There are many in our community who continue to offer grace to others through our weekly food collection. Although we don't know the people who receive these donations, perhaps we can offer a prayer for them as we place our donations out for pickup. A simple prayer that those who receive this food may feel God's extravagant care for them and know how loved they are. Sometimes the simplest gesture can mean the world to someone. Earlier this year, I was speaking to a woman whose husband was dying. She mentioned that friends brought over meals and filled up her car with gas, and how much these practical gifts meant to her. Her gratitude was overflowing. She clearly had experienced God's extravagant grace. She went on to say how much support her 3 children and their families had given her, how blessed she felt to have them, and how very grateful she was for all they had done for her. As I listened, I knew she had opened her heart and accepted God's extravagant grace through their presence and practical support. In this sharing, she conveyed the mutuality of God's grace. Her friends and children embodied God's extravagant love to her. And as she shared her profuse gratitude for them, her words poured extravagant love into me. God's abundant grace was truly present. The last example is a story that appeared a few years ago in Stowe, Vermont's local newspaper, the Stowe Reporter. It's about Scott Brooks, a 77-year-old man who had retired to Stowe and remained active in many ways, including helping to start the lacrosse program at Stowe High School, and as an avid lifelong skier, skiing whenever he could. He had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer 3 years earlier. After undergoing many treatments, Scott decided that his quality of life no longer met his standards and chose to enter hospice care. Before doing so, his son and some friends urged him to take one more ski run down the slopes of Spruce Peak. He wasn't sure he was up to it, but they convinced him to try. 18 people skied that final run with him. The weather and snow were perfect that day. And afterwards, he smiled and said he was glad he did it. Here was God's extravagant grace, embodied in Scott's family and friends, and in an activity he had enjoyed throughout his life. Scott Brooks opened his heart, accepted that grace, and lived it as he walked into life's next dimension. Today's message of giving and receiving extravagant grace is found in life's simplest, most ordinary moments, as well as in life's most profound ones. This week, notice God's abundant grace as you walk through your day. Take time to ponder these moments, linger with them, and bask in their grace. Open your heart, accept God's grace, and live it generously.